I like Dragon Age, or more specifically, I like Dragon Age Origins. Now that Inquisition and 2 have been released, you'd think we'd have a better idea of what the franchise is overall. But do we? Despite what I hoped the series would be back in 2009, the landscape of games we've received have actually been vastly different from each other. Unlike BioWare's other hot property, and that would be Mass Effect, which had 3 separate titles but felt like they fit together, Dragon Age doesn't, the name and the odd cameo aside. Rather than take the Mass Effect concept, but in this instance evolve the world rather than the character, which I thought was the point, Dragon Age chooses to continually reinvent itself. But why? And why, damn it?
Let's start with what came first, because doing anything else makes very little sense. To call Origins KOTOR in a fantasy world would be more than fair, but in many ways, that's all it needed to be. Knights of the Old Republic is still one of the best games to ever use the Star Wars license, and to take those mechanics and apply them to a Tolkien-esque setting made perfect sense. It was the power placed in your hands and the roller coaster journey BioWare took you on which made it such a success though. Impregnating witches, being told to murder diseased children, deciding who should rule over the kingdom, every major outcome had to go through your Grey Warden, meaning by the time the titles rolled, you felt like you were the most important person on the planet. Or Vince McMahon. This, of course, was all preceded by the excellent origin stories that prologued the experience. Although short and somewhat throwaway, they warmed you into events perfectly and gave you a sense of place in the world. You had a past, and if you were a massive loser like me and always toyed with the idea of suspending your disbelief, these would shape how your character grew as the hours fell by the wayside. That's not to say that Dragon Age Origins is the perfect game. It's not. The combat hasn't aged well, and trying to return to it today is more difficult than you may have imagined. But this is now a game that's over 5 years old. As technology advances, it's only to be expected that older ideas will age. But that's what the sequels were meant to take care of. Continually evolve what had been put in place, conjuring up new adventures every time. On top of everything else, knowing you were planting these seeds for the future was incredibly exciting. Although that's not exactly how it all moulded together.
Hot off the success of Dragon Age, EA and BioWare were keen to announce Dragon Age 2. Now, while I understand your Grey Warden would just walk off into the distance, the blight being over and all, it was somewhat of a shame that a character you'd spent upwards of 60 hours with just vanished. And who's your replacement? This asshole! To try and argue that Hawk wasn't an attempt to make Dragon Age appeal to the greater market seems a little bit futile, but I was fine with that. A new protagonist can open new doors, both for the franchise and for new players to find it. The problem is that Hawk is an asshat, and he wasn't interesting at all. Worst of all, Dragon Age 2 felt nothing like Dragon Age Origins.
I am Cassandra Pentecost, Seeker of the Chantry.
BioWare's big gimmick with the sequel was the framed narrative, a device that would see you influence a story being told retrospectively. It sounded wonderful, not least because it seemed as if the choices placed in your hand would not only affect the present, but the future too. As the narrative was being told years later, you could see just how much you succeeded, or more than likely, screwed up. But after a big initial campaign when 2 was announced, the framed narrative took a huge step back. Be it the pressure put on the developer to hit a certain date, or just not being able to make it work like intended, it felt like an afterthought by the time we had the damn thing. Sure, it served as a way to advance time without events feeling rushed, but its impact was lacking at best. Then, as mentioned, was the focus on Hawk. There wasn't much wrong with the guy, but there wasn't much right with him either. It was far more difficult to paste some of your personality onto the man, simply because BioWare had done a lot of the work for you. He had a voice, quite literally, and ensuring he was a badass from start to finish played into every angle. Like I say, there's nothing wrong with that. Some of my favourite gaming heroes are ones who kick the crap out of everyone as if they were Stone Cold Steve Austin, but it was too big a step away from the Dragon Age I was used to. Furthermore, the groundbreaking choices I'd made just a couple of years prior appeared to be an afterthought, often touched on or hinted at but never brought to a grand resolution like I'd hoped. A huge part of this was the introduction of a new protagonist, with our old friend hanging out in the woods or something, but all of Origins floated to the wayside. There was a very strong sensation that Dragon Age 2 was supposed to be steering the whole franchise in a new direction, or at least towards the wounded flipping coast. That's why combat changed. That's why previous characters weren't as prominent as I expected, and ultimately it's why we had 2 games that weren't as cohesive as one would have assumed.
Which brings us to Inquisition. Now, taken out of context and by itself, Inquisition is a great RPG, and it's a damn sight better than Kingdoms of Flippin' Amalur, which people also told me was good. It's not. It's just not a Dragon Age game. Although saying that doesn't really mean anything. More specifically, it's not a Dragon Age Origins game. Influenced by the likes of Skyrim, Assassin's Creed, Dark Souls, and for some reason the MMO, the only real Dragon Age things comes in the form of choices or cameos from the past that sometimes rear their heads. I'm not saying that these ideas aren't entertaining, because they are, but every Dragon Age game feels like an appeal to get new players or try something fundamentally different. Mass Effect 1, 2 and 3 may not be on the same disc, but it feels like a complete experience. It's a shame Freddie Prinze Jr. had to turn up and ruin it for everyone, but you'd be hard pressed to argue that Commander Shepard's adventure doesn't have a very specific start, middle and end. That's what I dreamed of for Dragon Age. Become WWE Champion, somehow play with Metallica, and have Dragon Age carve out this niche. I understand why the former didn't happen, but why didn't the latter? Ultimately, BioWare have released 3 great RPGs within the fantasy genre, easily competing or even king of the field in the year they release. To say it didn't live up to my personal expectations though would be more than fair. Still, who gives a shit, right? Thank you, internet person, for watching my video. If you'd like to see more, there's a subs button about here that you can click to subscribe obviously, or if you're a little more old fashioned, you can send me something in the post and my address is just around here. Either way, always believe, stay powerful.